Hello, my name is Maia Sauren. I'm speaking to you today about exploiting brain vulnerabilities, chaotic good at scale. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where I live, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm going to start with a story. When I was a child, I broke my head upon the hills of Armageddon. Sounds very dramatic, but that actually happened. I really did break my head open. When I was a child, I lived in Israel on a mountainside overlooking the Al-Megiddo Valley, which once upon a time during many, many years was the site of a lot of bloody wars. And when it was translated into the English Bible, it became known as Armageddon. And that used to be the view out my window for a while. Here's another way of telling you the same story. Let me tell you about the time I was rushed to hospital during a bomb raid in Israel. Also true, it was during a bomb raid. Here's another way of telling you yet the same story. I fell over once when I was 5. This is also true. I was playing with a friend outside and I had to be taken to hospital for stitches. It just happened to be during a bomb raid. I'm pretty sure my parents were not very happy about it. All of those were different ways of telling you the exact same truth. Now, in my day job, I'm a consultant, which basically means corporate relationship therapy. And if you've ever done any kind of the talkie type of therapy, you'll know that most of it is about changing people's minds and reframing what the truth is. So, for example, imagine you're the CEO of a large bank and you've come across this whole agile shtick and you've been convinced that this is the future for your organization. This will help make everything easier and faster and more efficient. And you've sold your vision to your management, your stakeholders, and you've started the entire bank on this journey of transformation and moving across to a new way of doing things. And your entire organization is now heading into the future. Now, the people that haven't necessarily bought into this vision are Priyanka, the app developer. She didn't make this decision, she's had it foisted upon her. Same with James, the middle manager. He also didn't choose this, and he's suddenly having to understand a whole new landscape of information and changes and new power dynamics. The other person that didn't choose this is Gary. Gary's retiring in 7 months, and he's one of the people that's holding the COBOL together with paddle pop sticks and rubber bands, and they don't make Garys anymore. So the bank hires a bunch of expensive consultants to come in and execute the vision. Hi. So a big part of my day job is to help people like Priyanka and James and Gary through the straits of organizational change as painlessly as possible. So my job is literally changing people's minds and trying to help them understand the truth in a few different lights. Now, in a previous life, I stood in darkened rooms and had photos gratuitously taken of me in white lab coats. Didn't actually need the lab coat, but it did make for a good photo. Really what I was doing in my previous life was researching the field of radio frequency safety compliance of mobile phones, and I did in fact use that robot in that photo. It is a pretty awesome robot. The field of RF safety has a really interesting PR problem where the scientists all agree. The science is well established and accepted. We've been doing research into the effects of mobile phone and radio frequency safety in general since World War II. And the results are fairly conclusive. There's no adverse health effects, basically, is what all the scientists say. And mobile phones and radio frequency in general, very similar to climate change and vaccination, has a very similar situation where even though the science is really conclusive and the scientific community agrees that evidence is clear and overwhelming, there are still many people who won't believe what's going on and will not agree with this view. And the media reports quite different things about what the science says and what the views are. Now, this would be a really good time to show you some hilarious internet arguments about these kinds of topics, but I already broke my head open once this talk, so we're going to skip that part. Now, the really interesting issue here that the people that don't believe the evidence for whatever reason, the issue is not that they're wrong or that they disagree with a mainstream view, but that due to their view, their behavior becomes harmful to a lot of people, to a much larger percentage of the population than just themselves. For example, a person that doesn't immunize their kids harms all the people in their community, all the people that their children and their children's contacts come in contact with. And a person that campaigns against mobile phone towers in their suburbs creates worse reception for everyone. Now, Priyanka, that refuses to participate in stand-ups, she's blocking the organization's entire ability to improve operations. So any person that isn't complying with the group norms, whether they agree with them or not, a person that isn't following standard operating procedures or just goes against the way the group is going, limits the group's ability to achieve its goals and move forward, whatever those goals are. Now, group goals and group norms are established a bunch of different ways, and this is one of the ways in which we can think about it. You may have heard of something called the Overton window. It was formulated as a concept by Joseph Overton, who's a US policy analyst, quite a while ago now. And he talks about the window of discourse, like what is it that it is acceptable to say and think in public. He was specifically talking at the time about what kinds of policies and views it's okay for a politician to espouse in order to either be elected or re-elected into office. So somebody that wants to take office needs to be very much within the center of the Overton window. They need to support and talk about views that are publicly acceptable and are considered policy or mainstream. Now, like most principles named after a person, this one has a complicated history, isn't actually named after the person that came up with it. But we'll move on. Now, it's possible to move the Overton window, something that happened after Joseph Overton allegedly named this concept, is that people started considering this as a whole framework. Not only does the window describe what the views are, but it is possible to move it. And it becomes a tool rather than just a theory for understanding things the way they are, because the Overton window talks about what the group norms are at the moment, whatever the group size is, whether that's your high school friends or your team at work or your family. But it's also possible to think about those norms moving, and we each have our own Overton window about a variety of views, and exposure to other views makes that change over time in the same way that we change other people. And the way to change people's views is largely through repetition. New information becomes spoken about, and eventually, after a lot of repetition, human brains tend to calibrate to a whole new normal of what they believe and understand. And sometimes it takes a long time, but this is how women got the vote. This is how we got acknowledgement of country at the start of conference talks. This is how we get pronoun stickers. So some of these issues are further along than others. But my point is that this is a tool, and tool can be used by anyone. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of different tools that it's possible to use to hack your own brain and other people's brains to make them change their own minds, and not only change people's minds, but change what's normal within a group slowly and over time. But first, let me tell you about a case study. So clearly vaccination has had a lot of airplay in the last 12 months or so, and the Overton window has definitely changed what's going on with that, but mostly in ways that I'm not going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about a particular case study from a while ago. In 2014 in Australia, there was some concern about certain groups not immunizing their children or themselves for that matter. And one of the very successful anti-vax campaigns that happened was this one. It was called I Immunize. And Australia in general has a fairly high immunization uptake, but the concern was about particular communities of alternative lifestyles, and we're just going to skate right past all the implications of what that phrase entails for the moment. And there was a campaign that was all about the concept of in-group bias, which it was about making people identify with someone else and think about themselves as belonging to a similar group to whoever is in the poster and trying to change their minds that way. So Andrew here in this picture, who is 33, he's Freo local, so he's a local to the area where the area of concern for this particular targeted campaign was. He uses cloth nappies, eats whole foods, and he immunizes. And you can see him carrying a baby in a colorful piece of cloth. So in his group, his behavior would be normal, even celebrated. And that was the point. This is an identity-based campaign. There's this thing, one of the many biases in our brain is in-group bias, and whether we notice it or not, we listen more to the opinions of people with whom we identify. There's a part of our brain that's constantly sitting around just saying, I'm right, everything I do is correct. There's times when your brain tells you something completely different, and that's not a great thing, and that's not a fun time to be having. We've all been there. But largely, human brains have a sustaining mechanism that basically runs this whole script that's saying, I'm correct and everything I do is all right. And it creates confidence in our own actions and views, because human brains are both very smart and very dumb at the same time. So here's the way this bias works. I'm right. Therefore, people like me are also right because I'm right and they agree with me. It's a secular argument, but again, smart and dumb at the same time. And the next part of this goes, people who are like me are more likely to be right. And whether I notice it or not, I'm going to identify with certain kinds of people and therefore take their views more seriously. You might have heard this bias mentioned a lot around conversations about hiring for diversity. People who do hiring tend to identify with people who look and talk and dress and act like themselves, and therefore hire people who are not very diverse. So we end up with fairly non-diverse workplaces unless we work very hard to do something different. So in the anti-vax campaign that I just talked about, which was in fact very successful, 77% of the individuals that were exposed to these kinds of posters, and they were everywhere. They were at schools, at childcare centers, in all over the place. 77% of the individuals that participated in the study, with no difference between people from alternative and non-alternative lifestyles, again, we're getting past that, felt that the campaign had a positive impact on their view of immunization. Here's the really interesting part. 17% of the people that came in touch with this campaign and participated in the study, on them it had a negative effect. Vaccine hesitant participants reported more negative thoughts and feelings in response to the campaign than non-hesitant individuals. So when we translate that, that means that people who started off as thinking that vaccines are bad, every time they saw one of these posters, they continued to think that vaccines are bad. Their minds absolutely did not change, but they were really activated and felt very negative things and had negative thoughts and negative feelings. And they not only continued thinking that the vaccines are bad for them, for their children, but they just felt agitated and upset every single time they came in contact with those things. And that is another brain vulnerability that's possible to exploit, because people who just won't believe the thing that you're telling them can be manipulated precisely with that, because they're coming into contact with something that's constantly making them feel bad. So they will eventually likely opt out of groups. It's possible to make people leave a group by constantly making them feel uncomfortable. It's not always something you want to use, and it's a bit of an option of last resort, but it is there. Something else that is possible to do in order to either move the Overton window for an individual or a group is just not talk about things. Just have certain facts never spoken about. That was something interesting that came out of the radio frequency safety research area that I saw happen, is that any time mobile phones were mentioned in the public sphere, we saw a rise in public concern. And that was regardless of how reassuring the message was or how trustworthy the source. Made no difference. Anytime it hit the news, people were more concerned, which meant that the converse was also true, that when the topic was out of the news, public concern dropped and largely disappeared. So it is in fact possible to control public opinion in a few different ways. Now I'm going to cover a few more tools that are probably more useful on an individual scale if you don't have access to the kinds of resources that let you have public campaigns through a whole town. And the thing to remember about any of these tools for changing people's minds and moving in Overton windows and thinking about group dynamics is that they do tend to be chaotic. Not only are we affecting other people, but other people are affecting us. You know, we hack each other. Not only that, but the results are largely non-linear, but they are generally effective. Now, the first thing I want to mention is that tech problems are about humans. That's one of the first things we need to realize, is that people are full of feelings, and each one of us has our own mysterious idea of what's normal and acceptable, and that's different to ours. And that can be true for even the team that's working next to you, and even two groups with largely overlapping individuals can have slightly different or wildly different norms around what it's okay to say and how it's okay to behave. Another thing it's important to remember is that change is uncomfortable, and any kind of change, and that doesn't matter whether that's been created because of something any of us want or not, but change you didn't choose is particularly uncomfortable. And a lot of what I do is work with people who have had change foisted upon them, and people who are in discomfort are really not easy to get along with. People who didn't choose their change are extra uncomfortable, and they become hostile and resistant, and they don't want to hear anything I have to say. They're actively avoiding anything that interferes with their hostility and their anger, because that invalidates their discomfort. And all of us are full of feelings all of the time, whether we're aware of it or not. And the important thing to remember is that in order to change, people's feelings have to change. The facts don't always make a difference. Like, I'm literally a doctor of mobile phones don't give you brain cancer, and very rarely has telling people that made any difference to what they think about things. So how do you change people's feelings? I mean, sure, we can be nice and eventually something will happen, but really, if people are in an uncomfortable situation, how do we make things less uncomfortable? Item number one is that if I'm trying to change someone's mind or their feelings, they see me as the enemy. So we are in enemy bias mode, which means that people who want things I don't want are not like me, and therefore they're wrong. The opposite of in-group bias, for example. And if I come in as the consultant and I'm trying to create change in the organization, obviously I'm immediately set as the enemy, which is very hard because I can't make any effective change from there. To change people's minds, I need to change their feelings, and feelings mean that we are suddenly in a situation of conflict, which means I need to kick in conflict resolution techniques. Now, humans are largely not great at conflict. We often have not very great models for how to deal with it. And not all of us are great at feelings. Not all of us are great at just dealing with the fact that we have feelings, much less having to deal with them. Everybody brings their own cultural assumptions about how it's okay to handle conflict, whether it's okay to tackle it head on or talk about it or not talk about it. And when I say cultural, I mean really microcultural. Sometimes it's about what you learned at home or at school, but sometimes it's about what's acceptable in the team that you're working in. And we all inhabit a lot of different microcultures. We go from a lot of different groups, with multiple friendship groups, from groups who volunteer with, our extended families. So these things are not consistent person to person. But basic conflict resolution skills usually come in handy. So for example, the first thing to do is remove any kind of negative or accusative sounding words. Remove words like should, you should, no. Remove words like no. Try and phrase things in a positive light, or try and find ways to talk about things in a way that's moving them forward. Also remove the word you from conversations. You might have noticed that I've spent a lot of this talk centering myself, talking about my experiences. It's a good practice to get into in general, but it's very useful around diffusing conflict. Even when I'm talking with people who know these tricks, who are really familiar with it, and they can recognize that I'm trying to say something like, try doing this, but really I phrased it as, if I was in this position, this is the kind of thing I would do. Even people who know this are still susceptible to feeling more calm and less hostile when these tricks are applied. It's just the way brains are. This tactic is just effective. Another tactic that's really effective is becoming part of the group. So moving myself from the enemy to, again, allowing the in-group bias to take effect. Now, belonging to a group or having people identify with me means that I need people to know things about me. I need to belong to the group, and that only happens to the extent to which I'm willing to share of myself. And that brings up all kinds of interesting questions and thoughts around boundaries, and they need some careful navigation, and that's a whole separate talk in itself. So I'm going to move straight past this, just mention that it's definitely a thing worth considering. Another thing that I found really useful is creating positive associations with myself. Sometimes I'll take people out for coffee or talk about fun things, but for a completely different reason. Some time ago, I started this Friday sticker game where I walk around on a Friday to everyone in my team and I say, what have you done this week that you're proud of? And I coax people until they can tell me something, and I give them a sticker, and that's it. That's the game. I didn't do it for this reason, but it does tend to create positive associations because people then have memories of feeling proud of themselves while talking to me. It's a bit weird, manipulative when I think about it like that, and that's not why I do it, but I can't pretend that that's not true. That is, in fact, a thing that happens. A really effective trick is finding somebody in the group who already thinks either a little bit like me or a lot like me, and getting them to be the person who's the spokesperson for my cause. So if I'm wanting people to adopt different kinds of developer practices or communication practices, and there's someone in the group who already thinks that these are good ideas, I can feed them information. I can give them facts. I give them a more informed voice and support them in any way I can to have a voice that's useful in that group, because people are more likely to already listen to them. They already have an established trust relationship. Having small group conversations tends to be a lot more valuable than not. I've found that if I can let people actually talk to me in a quiet time, there's a lot more openness. I'm a lot more likely to sway people's minds. And if I can ask open questions like, tell me more, or what do you think about this, or why do you think that? I get much better results of getting to the root of what people's problems are. And once they've started talking to me, it's really important for me to listen, because I might find out that their issue isn't coming to stand up. Maybe their issue is that they can't make it on time because they've got child drop off or something. I actually do need to seriously listen to their concerns and find out why it is that they think what they do, because now this sounds really dumb and obvious, but people only do things that make sense to them, which means that if they're doing something, they're doing it because it makes sense to them. Not only that, but they solve the problems that they've got, not the problems that I've got. They're prioritizing their own pain. And it's possible to think about ways to circumnavigate that. For example, some organizations will give you 10% off for paying on time because they're trying to appeal to something positive and make it a positive experience rather than a negative one. Now, some hard things are going to be harder than others, and it's very important to know where to draw the line on where I spend my energy. For example, Gary is retiring, and he's just not going to be interested in hearing anything I have to say. And it's going to be much better for me to just accept that and not try and change his mind too hard, because I'll be wasting a lot of time and energy, and actually it won't solve very much. In terms of prioritizing time and energy, sometimes it's really worthwhile thinking about, is it important for me to intervene at this point, or is it good enough for this person to be a little more right today than they were yesterday? You might have heard sometime the adage of, before you speak, pick at least two. Is the thing you're saying kind? Is it true? Is it useful? This is one of those things. Partway there might be good enough, and I don't need to correct anyone right this minute because they're moving towards where I want them to be, and slow stepwise change is going to be more effective and stick around for longer than something else. So I mentioned that people solve their own problems. If I want someone to solve a problem I've got, I need to reframe it as a problem that they've got. I need to find a way to highlight the pain in it for them that they want to solve, and highlight the benefits for them making that go away. Like I said, tech problems are human problems. And it might be hard but straightforward to set up encryption, but it's often a lot harder getting people to actually use it, because the tools might be there, but people might want to use them for a whole lot of reasons. And it's going to be a lot more valuable thinking about what human issues we've got in this situation and solving for those than focusing exclusively on the technological problems. Because, you know, Armageddon's still there, and I don't know if you've watched the news recently, but there still isn't peace in the Middle East, no matter what technology improvements we've made throughout the world. And unless you want to never work with anyone ever again, sooner or later, we're all going to have to learn how to deal with groups and people, by which I mean manipulate ourselves and others to get our own way. Sometimes it's ourselves we need to work on to create a change. Humans will generally subvert the technology problems that they've got, or the technology solutions that they've got, to solve whatever problem they perceive to be having. So it's kind of important to frame the truth in terms of what the problem that we think is, as opposed to what it necessarily presents itself, and reframe what the solutions are. I've thrown up the links to all the different pictures I've shown you here, but basically here is a summary of everything I've told you. Tech is largely human problems, and humans are full of feelings, and their brains are vulnerable to being hacked, which is a chaotic but largely reliable process. And it's usually useful to learn how to hack yourself and others for at least ideally good instead of evil. Thank you very much. If you want to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter as Sauren Maia, and I'll answer any questions there.